I hike by myself most weekends if the weather's decent. It's easier than trying to get friends to commit to driving a couple hours just to spend half a day walking around. This happened in early October a few years ago, on a Saturday. I left Atlanta around 7 in the morning and drove up into Chattahoochee National Forest. It was one of those cooler fall mornings where you could leave the windows down. I stopped at a gas station about 30 minutes before the trailhead, grabbed a turkey sandwich and a coffee, then ate before I got back on the road. I think I started hiking a little after 10. The first part of the hike was pretty normal. There were enough people around that you'd pass somebody every few minutes. Couples, a few families, people with dogs. It wasn't crowded. You just weren't by yourself. About 20 minutes in, I came across an older guy standing a few feet off the trail with a folded map. He had on a faded blue jacket even though it wasn't that cold. I said, "Morning." He nodded. "Morning." That was it. I kept going and forgot about him. About a mile later, I stopped at an overlook to take a few pictures since the leaves were starting to change. I was probably there 5 minutes. Not long after I got back on the trail, I heard footsteps behind me. When I looked back, it was the same guy in the blue jacket. I figured there had to be another trail that connected somewhere, or maybe I'd spent longer at the overlook than I thought. Either way, I didn't pay much attention to it. About 15 minutes later, the trail split. One way headed back toward the main loop. The other took a longer route with a creek crossing. I wasn't in any rush, so I took the longer one. For the next half hour or so, I didn't see anyone. Then I heard footsteps again. Just someone walking. I looked back, and there he was again. He stayed well behind me, maybe 70 or 80 yards. What stuck out to me was that he never got any closer. A little later, I stopped to get a drink of water. The footsteps stopped too. I stood there for maybe 20 seconds. Nothing. When I started walking again, I heard them again maybe 30 seconds later. I figured maybe he was taking breaks whenever I did. Maybe we just walked at about the same pace. But it kept happening. I'd stop. The footsteps stopped. I'd walk. A little later, they'd start again. After a while, it was hard not to notice the pattern. At the next junction, I checked the trail map and saw a connector that went back toward the parking lot. It wasn't the way I'd planned to go, but I decided to cut the hike short. I took the connector. A few seconds later, I looked back. The man reached the intersection and turned onto the same trail without even slowing down. He didn't look at the map. He just followed the connector. I didn't have a good explanation for that. Near the bottom of the hill, there was a big fallen tree beside the trail. I stepped behind it and crouched down like I was tying my boot. I could hear him walking. Then the footsteps slowed. Then they stopped. I waited a few seconds and leaned out just enough to look. He was standing in the middle of the trail. He looked straight ahead for a second, then slowly looked to one side and then the other, like he was trying to find somebody. I don't know how long he stood there, long enough that I started wondering if he'd heard me step off the trail. Then I heard people talking uphill. A family with 2 kids came around the bend. The man looked toward them, turned around, and walked back the way he'd come. I stayed where I was until the family reached me. Then I fell in behind them and walked the rest of the way to the parking lot. I threw my backpack in the car but didn't leave right away. I sat there for a minute answering a text. As I pulled out, I looked over at the trailhead kiosk. The man in the blue jacket was standing beside the information board. He wasn't looking at it. He was watching the cars leaving the parking lot. I still hike alone sometimes, but I haven't gone back to that trail. Maybe there was a normal explanation for everything that happened that morning. I just haven't come up with one that explains why every time I changed my plans, he seemed to make the same decision. I took a week off work a couple of springs ago and flew out to Washington because I'd never been to Olympic National Forest. I'm a physical therapist, so I'm on my feet all day anyway, but hiking is still how I usually unwind. My plan was to spend a few days driving to different trailheads instead of trying to squeeze everything into one hike. This happened near the end of the trip, in late April. I remember the weather because it worked out about as well as I could have hoped. It had rained that morning, but by the time I started hiking around 3, it had cleared up. Everything was still wet, but the rain had stopped. Before I left the parking lot, I finished half of a chicken wrap I'd picked up at a grocery store earlier that day. I filled my water bottle, looked over the trail map one more time, and headed out. The first stretch of trail had a few other hikers. I passed an older couple heading back toward the parking lot and a group of younger hikers going in. After another 15 or 20 minutes, I stopped seeing anyone. Around the next bend, I saw a man standing off to the side of the trail. He had a huge backpack. It looked way too big for a short afternoon hike. None of the gear matched. Different colored straps, an old sleeping pad hanging off one side, and a metal cup clipped to the outside. When I got close, he said, "How much farther to the viewpoint?" I said, "About a mile, I think." He thanked me. I kept walking. That was all. About 15 minutes later, I found a patch of wildflowers beside the trail. I stepped off to take a couple pictures with my phone. I figured he'd just walk past me. Instead, I noticed he'd stepped off the trail too. He didn't come over. He stopped maybe 30 yards away and crouched by his backpack like he was fixing one of the straps. When I got back on the trail, he started walking again behind me. I didn't think much about it. Packs shift around. People stop to adjust them all the time. A little farther on, there was another opening where you could see a creek below. I stepped off the trail again. Same thing. He stopped too. This time he took the backpack all the way off and set it on the ground. I stood there a little longer than I needed to because I assumed he'd keep going once he finished. He didn't. When I started walking again a minute or so later, I heard him pick the pack up and start walking too. I remember thinking maybe it was just one of those weird coincidences. After that, though, I started paying attention. At another viewpoint, I stopped one more time. Same result. He stayed where he was until I got moving again. After that, I quit stopping. The trail narrowed through a muddier section where the ground hadn't dried out from the rain. I happened to look down and noticed another set of boot prints. They weren't behind mine. They were right beside them. I stopped for a second to look. I hadn't noticed him walking next to me. Every time I'd looked back, he'd been behind me. I don't know how those tracks ended up there. I kept walking. A few minutes later, I decided to skip the last overlook and head back. On the way back, I didn't hear him much, but once or twice I caught movement through the trees behind me. Eventually, I got back to the restroom building near the trailhead. I went inside mostly because I wanted a few minutes to myself. I washed my hands, filled my water bottle again, and stayed there longer than I normally would. When I came back out, he was sitting alone at a picnic table facing the restroom. He wasn't eating anything. His backpack was still on. He looked up when I came outside. We looked at each other for a second. Neither of us said anything. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. As soon as I did, he stood up, turned away from the parking lot, and walked into the trees beside the trail. Not toward the viewpoint. Not toward any of the cars. Just into the woods. I stayed there until a park maintenance truck pulled into the lot. The driver got out to empty a trash can, and I walked over and asked if he'd seen a guy with a big backpack. He said he hadn't. Before I left, I told a ranger what had happened. She asked me what the guy looked like and wrote it down, but she didn't recognize the description. Nothing ever came of it. I finished the rest of the trip without hiking alone again. I stuck to busier trails after that. I've thought about that afternoon more than once. Maybe I was reading too much into it. The part I still can't explain is why every time I stepped off the trail, he stopped too. If he was really trying to get to the viewpoint, he could have walked right past me more than once. He never did. I don't think the hike itself was the weird part. Looking back, what gets to me is that somebody might have decided to follow me almost as soon as I parked. This happened about 3 years ago. In the middle of November. I was 31 and doing freelance photography then. I usually went out on weekdays because there were fewer people around. That morning I drove into Pisgah National Forest before sunrise to shoot a couple of waterfalls. It was supposed to stay cloudy all morning, which is pretty much ideal for waterfall photos. I stopped at a gas station outside the forest for coffee and a biscuit. By the time I got to the trailhead, it was a little after 8. There were only a couple of vehicles in the lot. I remember thinking that was nice, because the place gets packed on weekends. One of the vehicles was an older pickup, dark green maybe, or faded black. I didn't pay much attention to it except there was a guy sitting behind the wheel. I figured he was on his phone or waiting for somebody. I put on my camera backpack, grabbed my trekking pole, locked my car, and headed up the trail. I glanced back once. The truck was still there, and the guy was still inside. The trail started alongside a creek before climbing into the woods. Most of the leaves were already down for the year. The ground was still damp from rain earlier that week, but it wasn't cold enough to bother with my jacket. I spent about 40 minutes stopping here and there for photos of little waterfalls, moss, and whatever else caught my eye. I wasn't in a rush. The first odd thing was hearing somebody walking behind me. It wasn't loud, just a few crunches through the leaves. I figured another hiker had started after me and was catching up. I even stepped off the trail once to let them pass. Nobody did. When I started walking again, I heard it again maybe 100 yards later. Every time I stopped, it stopped. I told myself it was probably just sound echoing around the woods. That happens sometimes, especially with wet air and dry leaves. A little later, I crossed a creek and noticed fresh boot prints in the mud. Mine were already there from a few minutes earlier. These prints weren't coming from the other direction. They were right beside mine, headed the same way. They also looked deeper, like the person was heavier than me or carrying more weight. I stood there for a few seconds and looked up and down the trail. Nobody. I crossed over and kept going toward a little stream just off the trail. I'd photographed it before and wanted to try another angle while the water was still running high. I was only planning to be there for a minute, so I leaned my trekking pole against a tree by the trail and walked over with just my camera. I wasn't gone more than a minute. When I came back, the pole was gone. For a second, I thought I'd picked the wrong tree. Then I found it on the ground several feet away near another tree. Nothing else was missing. My backpack was still on me. My camera was fine. The pole couldn't have rolled that far because the ground was basically flat. I'd left it standing against the tree. I picked it up and kept going. I also quit stopping for photos every couple of minutes. I'd planned to hike another mile to a bigger waterfall before turning around. Instead, I decided to head back. Nothing specific happened that made me do it. I just wasn't having much fun anymore. The walk back felt longer even though it was mostly downhill. Every so often I'd hear leaves crunch behind me again. Not all the time. Just enough that I kept noticing it. When I got near one of those orange trail markers nailed to a tree, I looked back for the first time in a while. There was a man standing in the trees, maybe 80 yards behind me. Part of him was hidden behind a trunk, but I recognized the dark jacket and baseball cap. He looked like the guy I'd seen sitting in the pickup that morning. He wasn't moving. He wasn't taking pictures. He was just standing there looking in my direction. I waited a second, thinking maybe he'd say something. He didn't. So I turned around and kept walking. A little farther down, the trail ran alongside an old Forest Service road. It wasn't paved, but maintenance trucks still used it. I got up on the road instead because I figured if somebody was actually following me, I'd rather not stay in the trees. A couple of minutes later, I heard an engine. It was one of the utility trucks. I stepped into the road and waved. The driver stopped and rolled his window down. "You okay?" I'd appreciate a ride back to the parking lot. He unlocked the passenger door without asking any questions. As I got in, I looked back toward the woods. I could still see the man between the trees. As soon as the truck stopped for me, he turned and walked farther into the woods. He never looked toward the road. He never acknowledged either of us. The driver dropped me at the trailhead a few minutes later. I thanked him, loaded my gear, and started putting everything back in my car. The pickup was gone. Then I noticed muddy boot prints around my car. There were several by the driver's door and a couple behind the rear bumper. That caught me off guard. I'd parked on dry gravel. There wasn't any mud around my parking spot when I got there, and I hadn't seen anybody anywhere near my car before I left. I stood there trying to figure out when those prints could have been made. Maybe before I started hiking. Maybe while I was out on the trail. Maybe after I got back, before the utility truck reached the lot. I really don't know. I've been back to Pisgah since then, just not that trailhead. I still go out to photograph waterfalls whenever I can. I just don't hike there by myself anymore, and I don't really want to know why somebody spent part of that morning following me.